In this video, we'll cover how you use completing the square to solve quadratics. So when I first look at this quadratic, I can tell that it's got three pieces to it, which might lead me to believe that I should use the star method. So if I start to do the star method with this one, I'll see that my A is 1, my B is 16, and my C is -9. Now, whenever I do my star and I set it up, my star would look like 1x and 1x. In the top would be -9, and in the bottom would be 16. But if I think about -9, the only way I can get -9 is if I either multiplied a 3 times a -3, or a -1 times 9, or a +1 times -9. So none of those answers though are going to give me this 16, which means that I'm not going to be able to use the star method for this particular problem. Now I could use the quadratic formula, but I want to show you another alternative, which is completing the square. So if I want to do completing the square, the first thing I need to do is I need to make sure that in front of my x squared, it's an imaginary 1. So basically I want to make sure that my A is 1. So the other thing I want to do is I want to get this constant number to move to the other side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, to do that, I'm going to add 9 to both sides. And so when I add 9 to both sides, I'm going to end up with x squared plus 16x equals +9. Now, this 9, once I move it over, is not C. So I'm going to ignore this 9 for right now. Now, in order for me to be able to complete the square, I need to figure out what a C would be. So I'm going to start with saying A is 1, B is 16, and then to get C, I'm going to do B over 2, and then square that number. So I know that my B is 16, so it's going to be 16 over 2, and then I'm going to square that number. So 16 over 2 is going to give me 8, and then I'm going to square that number. So my C is going to end up being 64. So now I'm going to write a new equation using that 64 as my C. So it's going to look like 1x squared plus 16x plus 64 equals 9. Then I have to add in that 64 here too, because I want to keep these two sides balanced. So if I added 64 on the left side, I also need to add 64 on the right side. So whenever I do that, that is going to give me a new quadratic. Now I want to be able to factor this quadratic, and if you'll remember to Friday, whenever we factor this quadratic, the easy way to do that is if I can remember what that number is that I had before I squared it when I was figuring out what my C is. And so what I would do is I would just say x plus whatever that number is squared, and that's going to give me this. So if I worked it out and did the star method with my A is 1 and my B is 16 and my C is 64, the top would be 1 times 64, which will give me 64. Now, if I want to multiply to get 64 to add to get 16, those two numbers would be 8 times 8. And so whenever I do that, I would fill it in and see that I can't reduce this side, and this side is the same thing. So that factors out to be x plus 8 squared. But to save me some time, as long as I know what my number was that I squared to get C, I can just plug it into x plus whatever that number was, and then square the whole thing, and I'm done with that side. On the other side, I've got 9 plus 64, which will give me 73. So at this point, I want to solve and try to figure out what x is. So I'm going to square root both sides to get rid of that squared, and that's going to give me x plus 8 equals, remember whenever I square root both sides, I've got to have a plus and a minus, and square root of 73 is not going to be perfect. So what I can do is go to my calculator, and I can type in square root of 73. Now, in order to do a square root, you're going to do second x squared, and then I'm going to type in 73 and hit enter, and that's going to give me 8.544. So we're going to use plus or minus 8.544. So at this point, that plus and minus means I'm going to split this up into two parts. I'm going to say x plus 8 equals positive 8.544. And then I'm going to go over here and do x plus 8 equals negative 8.544. So then, to solve and get x by itself, I'm going to subtract 8 from both sides. Whenever I do that, over here, I'm going to get x equals 0.544. Over here, I'm going to subtract 8 from both sides. And whenever I do that, I'm going to end up with x equals negative 16.544. So my two answers would be x equals 0.544 and x equals negative 16.544. On the next one, I've got x squared plus 8x minus 33 equals 0. So remember that in the end, I want to end up with something that looks like ax squared plus bx plus c equals x plus b over 2 squared. So this is what I'm looking for. So I'm going to start with making sure that I've got an a that's 1 and making sure that I move this constant to the other side. So my a is good. I'm going to move this 33 to the other side by adding it to both sides. That'll cancel, and I'll have x squared plus 8x equals 33. So now I'm going to identify what my a is, 1, my b is 8, and my c I'm going to get by doing b over 2 and then squaring it. So I know that b is 8, so 8 over 2, and then squaring it. 8 over 2 is 4, and then I'm going to square it, and so my c is 16. So I'm going to rewrite x squared plus 8x as x squared plus 8x plus 16 equals 33. But because I added 16 here, I need to balance it and add 16 on the right side as well. So then I'm going to simplify that. Remember that to simplify that, I'm going to basically write it as x plus b over 2 squared. So this is going to be x plus my b over 2 was 8 over 2, which was 4. So plus 4 squared. And then I would say 33 plus 16, which is going to be 49. So then my goal is to get x by itself. So I'm going to square root both sides because I've got the squared there. That's going to turn into x plus 4 equals. Remember, when I square root both sides, I do a plus and a minus. Square root of 44 is going to give me 7. Square root of 49 is going to give me 7. And so then, because I've got that plus and minus, I'm going to split it up. X plus 4 equals positive 7, and x plus 4 equals negative 7. So then I'm going to subtract 4 on both sides, and on the left side, I'm going to end up with x equals 3. On the right side, when I subtract 4 from both sides, I'm going to end up with x equals negative 11. X squared minus 6x plus 25 equals 0. So remember, in the end, I'm looking for ax squared plus bx plus c to equal x plus b over 2 squared. So I'm going to start with making sure my a is 1, which it is, and taking this constant and moving it to the other side. So then I'm going to end up with x squared minus 6x equals negative 25. So remember, I'm wanting it to look like ax squared plus bx plus c, so I've got to figure out what my c is. To do that, I'm going to say a is 1, b is negative 6, and my c is going to come from b over 2 squared. So my b is negative 6, so it's negative 6 over 2 squared. Negative 6 over 2 would be negative 3, and then I'm going to square it, and so my c is going to be equal to 9. So I'm going to rewrite my equation to look like x squared minus 6x plus 9 equals negative 25 plus 9. So I added 9 to the left. I also have to add it to the right to balance it out. I'm going to rewrite x squared minus 6x plus 9 to look like x plus b over 2. So this is going to be x, that would be a plus, but my b over 2 is negative 6 over 2, which is negative 3, so I'm just going to make it a minus 3. So my x minus 3 squared is going to equal negative 16. Then because I want to get x by itself, I need to get rid of the squared, so I'm going to square root both sides. When I square root both sides, that's going to give me x minus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of negative 16. Because it's a negative, I'm going to take out an I, and I know that the square root of 16 is going to be 4, so it's going to be plus or minus 4i. So then, because I've got that plus or minus, I'm going to split this up into x minus 3 equals positive 4i, and x minus 3 equals negative 4i. So I'm going to add 3 to both sides here. Those will cancel, and I'll get x equals 3 plus 4i. And over here, I'm going to add 3 to both sides. Those will cancel, and I'll end up with x equals 3 minus 4i. On the last one, I see that I've got 2x squared plus 8x minus 10 equals 0. So remember that each time we were trying to make sure that our x squared, the number in front of our x squared was a 1. In this case, it's a 2. Now when I look at all of the rest of the things in my equation, I can see that I can divide them all by 2, and they come out evenly. So what happens is this becomes x squared plus 4x minus 5 equals 0. So at this point, remember I take my constant and I move it to the other side. So I'm going to add 5 to both sides here, and those will cancel and give me x squared plus 4x equals positive 5. So now I want to get my a, b, and c to write my quadratic. So my a is going to be 1, my b is 4, and my c is going to come from b over 2 squared. Now I know that my b is 4, so 4 over 2 squared. 4 over 2 is 2. 2 squared gives me 4. So my c is 4. So that means I'm going to write this as x squared plus 4x plus 4 equals 5 plus 4. So then I'm going to rewrite my x squared plus 4x plus 4 as x plus 2 squared. The 2 came from when I did b over 2. b being 4, 4 over 2 is 2, so x plus 2 squared equals 9. Then I'm going to square root both sides because I'm trying to get x by itself, so I need my squared here to cancel. That's going to give me x plus 2 equals, got to have a plus or minus, square root of 9 is 3, so then I'm going to have x plus 2 equals positive 3, x plus 2 equals negative 3. Subtract 2 from both sides here. That's going to give me x equals positive 1. Subtract 2 from both sides here. X equals negative 5.